Hey everyone, and welcome to our May live event with Heather Thomas. Once again, Heather, thank you for being here to answer everyone's quilters questions.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. And so I know you mentioned you want to make a quick correction to something before we get into any new questions, so I'm going to let you do that.
I do. It was either last month or a couple of months ago, I gave the wrong name for my favorite batting. Who does that? Anyway, my favorite batting is actually called Orient, not Impress. And I don't know why. I guess Impress makes me think of the Orient, but it's called Orient, and it is by Quilter's Dream, which is what I had said before. It's a lovely mix of silk and tencel and rayon and cotton, and it's just fabulous. It's just my favorite batting. So it's called Orient, for those of you who are out there looking for Impress that doesn't exist. So I just wanted to clear that up.
Okay, and so that's how you found out that you said the wrong thing when someone was looking for it. So I guess if someone is looking for it, where do you normally find it?
Well, you know, I simply, I used to get it at my favorite quilt store. And I Googled it today, and 1,000 different places came up for you to purchase that, including Amazon. So it's pretty easy to get your hands on.
Perfect. All right, so we're going to get right into our first question here. This is from Donna. And she says that you once said that you always cut borders a little short, but she didn't write down by how much short you cut them. So if you could go over this again, she would be very happy.
Sure. If it's a small quilt that I'm working on, under 36 inches or so, then I'm going to cut the borders the right size. Usually you're not going to feed any excess in on a small piece. But if it's a larger quilt, say 36 to 72 inches or so, then I'm going to cut them about a quarter inch short. If it's bigger than 72 inches, then I'm going to cut them about a ½ inch short, maybe only 3/8. But what happens when you do this is that fabric gets stretched underneath the presser foot and with the feed dogs. And so this way, it kind of feeds that excess in as you go. And it just makes a beautifully, perfectly lying border, so you don't end up with any waviness or anything like that. So it's just a scant bit. So a smaller quilt, a quarter inch, a bed size quilt, 3/8 of an inch or so, and you're going to have a really nice fitting border.
Perfect. All right, our next question here, they say, I finally found Synthropol, but the instructions are for hand-dyed fabrics and hand washing. They have a front loading machine, so they want to know if they add it to the tub with the fabric or put it into the soap dispenser.
Just go ahead and put it in your soap dispenser like you would any other liquid soap. And basically the instructions on Synthropol talk about using it for hand dyes, yes. If it was manufactured, if it was packaged and sold to a quilt store, you can buy it at industrial supply stores, and it simply gives you instructions for washing. It also says that it needs to be used with hot water. But I find that using it with warm water is just perfect, and that's what I do. So I use, for a full load, 3 tablespoons of Synthropol and warm water.
Perfect. All right, our next question here, what thread do you use in the bobbin when using metallic thread? All of your previous hints using metallic needles and sewer's aid have been great.
What I tend to do is I use a cotton thread in the bobbin, and I choose a cotton thread that's as close to the metallic color as possible. So if I've got a gold metallic thread, then I'm going to use a gold colored cotton thread in the bobbin.
Okay.
When I use silver metallic thread, then I use a medium gray in the bobbin.
Okay. All right, our next question here, I am learning Freemotion quilting with my machine, but continue to have the thread shredding above the needle. It doesn't do this when I'm sewing straight lines. I've tried different threads and changing the needle more often. Do you have any suggestions?
Well, changing the needle more often is simply going to help keep a sharp needle. Chances are your needle is too small. So it's not necessarily that the needle is worn out or worn down, it's that it's just too small for your thread. If your thread is breaking right above the needle, right before the eye, shredding there, that means that it's getting too much wear and tear going through the eye of the needle. What most people don't understand is that, and I had a sewing machine repairman show me this, and I found it absolutely amazing, is that your thread goes through the eye of your needle about 10 to 12 times before it finally interacts with the bobbin thread, before it finally makes a stitch. And that wear and tear causes that thread to shred. if that needle eye is too small. So it's really important that you have the eye of the needle is large enough to accommodate your thread. One of the things that I really like about top stitch needles is that they have an elongated oval eye instead of a really narrow kind of a slot eye that so many of the other needles have. So I use top stitch needles most of the time, actually all of the time. So go up a size in needle. So if you're quilting with a 40 weight thread, you should be stitching with a size 90 needle. And a lot of times you're using an 80 because that's what you piece with. So move to a size larger needle and perhaps a needle with a different eye like that top stitch. And hopefully that will fix the problem.
Perfect. Our next question here, this is from Janet, and she says, I'm making a t-shirt quilt, and they have you put the fusible web a 1/4 inch from the edge to make the seam not so bulky, but the edge turns up and stretches and makes it hard to sew. Do you have any suggestions?
Fusible web or fusible non-woven interfacing?
Probably that. I think it's more about how the edges stretch because there's nothing fusible on those edges for the seams.
Okay. So they're having you, the patterns tells you to put the non-woven fusible interfacing on the back of the block, but not in the seam allowance.
Right.
Ah, that's kind of strange. I would probably switch to a lighter weight interfacing that's permanent and go all the way to the edge with it myself. I can't imagine stopping short of my seam allowance because that would roll up and be a royal pain. Yeah, to me that just sounds like a nightmare. So if you're only partially through piecing your piece, I would go get a lighter weight, the lightest weight fusible I could find, fusible interfacing, and put another back on those and go all the way out to that seam allowance, because other than that, I don't know what you're going to do. You've got that totally unstabilized little area. The only thing that you could do differently is if you stitched right on the edge of the stabilizer that you already have on. So you're taking kind of a chunky seam allowance, which, you know, on a quilt like a t-shirt quilt that doesn't have a lot of intricate piecing, having a chunky seam allowance isn't really going to hurt it in the long run. You're not going to end up with something that doesn't fit if you have a chunky seam allowance throughout everything. Things will still fit. So that might work in lieu of having to put more interfacing on it.
So then if you are using that interfacing across the whole thing and you do have bulkier seam allowances, how do you... You're going
to have slightly bulkier, but I'm talking about really lightweight non-woven. Non-woven is the most important word because the fact that it's an interfacing that's non-woven means that it has no stretch. So it doesn't need to be anything but really, really lightweight. You really can't, the lightweight stuff you can barely even feel in there. So it's really not going to make your seam allowances any more bulky. They're already going to be kind of funky and weird because it's t-shirt material and you're not used to that. We're used to quilts that have, you know, a crisp binding on them and or a crisp hand to them. And so that curling up is going to be a pain no matter what. Or at least that bulkiness is going to be a pain no matter what. And you know, making a t-shirt quilt is a whole different ball game, and you just have to kind of work with the weirdness of the fabric.
Okay, and so just a follow up, because I know we've gotten this emailed to us in questions previously, is how to quilt a t-shirt quilt. Whether you quilt over the motifs of the t-shirts, around them, what would you recommend for that?
Well, I think, you know, the main reason most people make a t-shirt quilt is because they want those emblems on the t-shirts to be the thing. If you were to do an all-over quilting pattern and cover them up, that's not a good idea. So I always suggest stitching around the motifs. And if the motif is big, putting a couple of contour lines somewhere inside the motif, meaning if there's a circle inside a banner, that you quilt around the circle, even though if it covers the banner a little bit. But just keeping those stitch lines about 2 to 3 inches apart in the portion of the design of the t-shirt, and then quilting somewhat heavily in the negative space with a stipple or something like that that's about every 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch, maybe even every inch. That way you're going to have a quilt that lasts a long time, and you're really going to show off those motifs, because when you quilt that heavily in the background, it's going to push those designs forward that are in the t-shirt portion and really show off that, which is, you know, why we make the t-shirt quilt to begin with.
Perfect. All right, I just want to remind anyone who's maybe just now joining us, or even if you've been watching from the very beginning, if you have any questions that you want Heather to answer, just type those into the comments underneath this video, and we will work our way through answering as many of those questions as possible. Our next question here, what features or information do you suggest putting on a quilt label?
Well, here, this depends on why you're putting the label on. If you're putting a label on because it's a gift that you're giving the quilt to somebody, then you can put all sorts of information, but you definitely want to put your name, the year it was made. If you have a relationship to the person, so if you're grandma or aunt or something like that, you can put that on there. If the quilt has a name, especially if it's a historical name, I would definitely give that if it's a particular type of block or something like that. If it was using reproductions from the 1800s, then you can put that. Information that you think would be relevant to anybody who is studying quilts or collecting quilts. So think about maybe when you're writing your label, that you're writing it for somebody at a museum who's got their hands on it. So a good deal of information, but not a whole lot of storytelling. You don't need to tell, you know, how many, it took you 18 hours to cut it and 42 hours. You don't need to, you know, none of that stuff. But just enough information that somebody can catalog that quilt. If it's just a quilt for you, then you can put as little or as much as you want. But one of my things that I'm kind of a stickler for is that you sign the front of that quilt. So I think it's important. It's best if, in my opinion, signed in the quilting. So practice machine quilting your name as much as you can and include it on the quilting, or write it with a permanent fabric marker hidden in a little corner somewhere. I think it's important that we sign the front of our work as much as it is that we label the backs of our work.
Perfect. And just because I like to draw attention to classes that you've done for us, you do have a class on Freemotion script that is available on the website, correct?
Yes, absolutely. And if you've never written on a quilt, oh, I tell you, it is very provocative to be able to put words on the surface of your artwork, and doing it in stitch is even better.
And just because I got to be there while you were actually filming that class, it's really kind of mesmerizing to watch somebody write on a quilt also. So if you want to just watch Heather, you know, take this class and learn how to do that, it's really fun to just watch her do that as well. All right, our next question here. It really is, really is. All right, our next question here, it says, most quilting patterns that I've read call for putting on top borders first and then the sides. Is there any reason the sides can't go on first?
No, there's no reason why the sides can't go on first. In fact, I almost always put my sides on first because then they don't have to be cut quite as long. So if you've already sewn your top and bottom on, then your sides have to be really long. And I actually think it looks better to have the sides sewn on first and then the top and bottom, especially on a bed quilt, because the bottom is what you see when you walk into a bed or into a quilt. You often see that bottom border first. So, you know, when somebody writes a pattern, they you know, go by what they've done before or what they did with this quilt, or, you know, I always make the quilt first and then write the pattern. I think a lot of people write the pattern first and then make the quilt, but and I'm always looking to get the most bang out of my buck when it comes to the fabric. And so I can usually get away with a ½ yard less border fabric if I cut the two sides first. And so I always do the sides first and then the top and bottom. So I think it's just a personal preference.
Perfect. All right, our next question here. My long arm quilter asks that I square up the quilt backing before sending it to them. It is 108 inches square. How can I do this without having to have a giant area?
Oh, that's a toughie. If it's 108 inches square, is it not squared up already? Sorry. Okay,
well, so it could be 108.5 by, you know what I mean.
So what she's saying is that it doesn't need to be perfectly square. When she asks you to square it up, what she needs is for you to make sure that it's relatively true. It doesn't have to be perfect. Perfect is not what she's looking for. But if it's really wonky, then it makes it hard for her to load it up onto her machine. So what I would do is I would take that piece and I would fold it in half, and then I would fold it that half in half so that it's in quarters. And I would, line up the edges as much as I possibly can. The outside raw edges, you're going to have one double fold side and one single fold side. And then you have two sides that have the raw edges. And if when you try to line those edges up, nothing really works well, nothing's lining up well, then I would rip. Okay, now ripping those edges is the best way to get true. And I would simply, whatever's hanging off, I would clip it and rip it. And, to me, that is, because when you rip something on the grain, and that's going to give you the truest measurement of that fabric, if you will. And you should have plenty of excess. So if you said 106 inches square, or what?
108. Yeah.
108 inches square, then I'm assuming that your quilt is only about 102 inches square. So you'll have excess to do that ripping. Your long armor just really can't handle having to do those extra steps to get that fabric loaded onto her machine. So she's simply asking that you be neat and tidy with your backing. A lot of people will just slam that backing together and throw it, and it's got excess here and excess there from where they pieced it or whatever. And it's just a nightmare. So what she's asking you to do mostly is to be considerate of her time and effort and make it as true as possible, not perfect. So hopefully that's helpful.
Absolutely. All right, our next question here, this is from Cheryl, and she says, what is your opinion of using store-bought bias tape for binding, and is there any time that this would be a good option?
Well, unfortunately, the store-bought bias tape is made from low-end gray goods, G-R-E-I-G-E, that's the base fabric. So it's not going to last as long as a higher-end quilting white fabric. So that's that. If you absolutely have to use it because you can't find anything else, sure, but I don't recommend it. You can buy pre-made bindings at quilt stores that coordinate with a lot of the fabrics that you could buy at the quilt stores, and those are made from the same quality of gray goods. And so those I think are okay, but the packaged bindings, no, they're just too low end in my opinion.
All right, sounds good. All right, next question here. Do you have any tips for quilting with silk dupioni?
Yeah, I quilt with silk dupioni all the time. It's actually one of my favorite things to make art quilts with. And if it's Indian dupioni, the kind that has the slubs in it, the lines and the slubs, then it behaves just like cotton. And you really don't have to do anything special with it. However, if it's Chinese dupioni, that's a whole different ball game. Chinese dupioni is a little bit slick and it kind of moves. So if I'm using, and Chinese dupioni doesn't have those slubs. It's kind of like a thin charmeuse. Anyway, I would put a permanent iron-on lightweight interfacing on that to make it behave like cotton before I even cut it. But if it's just the plain old Indian dupioni, which is what most people use, the only downside of it is that it can shred a bit. And so you need to make sure you use a very sharp rotary cutter if you're going to be piecing with it. And I would take my stitch length down a little bit smaller than I normally use. So if I normally sew with about 10 to 12 stitches to an inch, I'd go down to about 8 stitches to the inch. So if that's usually a 2.5 on your machine, I'd go down to about a 1 3/4. And that really takes care of any shredding or fraying that it does after it's been cut, because that is the one downside of piecing with it. I tend to use it a lot as big backgrounds that I, applique on or paint on or stencil on or whatever, but it quilts beautifully.
Perfect. All right, our next question that just came in, this is from Cindy, and she says, have you ever used size 8 pearl cotton for hand quilting or whole cloth quilt? She would appreciate anything you can share about your experience or suggestions.
Well, size 8 is a little bit on the chunky side. I would probably use a 10 or a 12 if I was going to be doing hand quilting with a pearl cotton. I know a lot of English quilters who do big stitch quilting with weights that are similar to the 8 pearl cotton, which means that you're only getting about 4 or 5 stitches to the inch. And it's similar kind of to a sashiko look. And it's done with the intent of that stitch really showing. It becomes part of the decorativeness of the surface, more so than the average hand quilting. Not that hand quilting isn't quite decorative, but we're talking about a chunky, right in your face decorative stitch. So if you've got a bunch of 8 already and you're wanting to use it up, just stitch pretty big. If you're wanting to use pearl cotton because you want that kind of look and you haven't purchased the 8 yet, then I would probably purchase a 10 or a 12 and use that instead. And you can get a nice 8 stitches or so to the inch, and a really nice stitch. I've used both, and I've done lots of sashiko quilting, not just sashiko stitching. And the 12 is actually my favorite to hand stitch with. But the 8 will work. Just make those stitches bigger and use a nice hefty needle.
Perfect. Now, this isn't necessarily a quilting class that you did for us, but you did a video where you did some sashiko stitching on some scarves.
Yes.
So if the video is also available on our website. So if you just want to see what sashiko stitching is and how to do it, it's a little shorter video, and you can make some fun scarves or use it on quilts.
Decorative stitch. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Our next question here: have you ever used a quilt as you go method? And if so, what is your favorite?
I haven't. I've never understood the need for it, or to me, it's just persnickety, and there's all this having to put stuff together in weird ways, and I don't think I think that it's a way to try to combat a fear that can be easily combated through practice. People are afraid of handling the bulk of a big quilt, and I think that's a shame, because once you stop thinking about the big quilt and just start thinking about the area that you're quilting under your machine, and if you stop thinking about, rolling it perfectly and this, that, and the other, and just get yourself a nice L-shape desk, so you have a table that you're sewing on and then a table to your left to help support that big quilt, then there's really no need to do all that little piece this section, quilt that section, piece this section, quilt that section, figure out how to sew those two together so that you can't see where the seam is. It's just, I've seen people do it, and it just, to me, it just seems like a nightmare. I know that there are a lot of people who swear by it, but I have to tell you, I don't have much experience with it. I tried it once and said, this is for the birds, and went back to my quilting my big old quilts and pretending like they're not big old quilts. So I just, no,
So that means you don't have a favorite method.
Pardon?
So that means you don't have a favorite method.
No, I don't have a favorite technique.
All right, perfect. Okay, our next question. Where do you purchase most of your supplies, such as the foils or the great paints that you have used?
Well, it's really interesting, because I used to have a store, and I was the person who did the ordering. So I ordered all those things and carried them in my store. So it was really easy for me to find. However, there's millions of places online now that carry all of these things. Pretty much, if you go to Google or whatever your search engine is, and you put the name of the item in, or the manufacturer of the item in, it's going to take you to a new and different place to go find it almost every time. Almost everything that I used that I've used for embellishment can be found at Dharma Trading. That's DHARMA trading.com. A lot of things can be found on Amazon. Embellishment Village is another one. So there's just all sorts of places online. One of the things that I do know, and that I think is important, however, is this: give your local quilt shop the opportunity to order it in for you. A lot of these things can be purchased from their regular wholesalers. They simply don't carry them because they haven't had a large call for them. But if you say, can you order this? You can even say, Heather on the computer said that you can get it from Brewer, or one of the other big wholesalers. They would probably like to do that for you. They would probably like to do that for you, because the small business owner is always looking to make another sale. And if you want that small business to stay in business, you've got to support them. Our quilt stores are closing left and right, and everything's online, and I can't complain. Online we all use it. But if you want the service and the classes and the personal interaction that you get with a quilt store, then you've got to do everything you can to keep those quilt stores in business. So I always say, give them the first opportunity. If they can't find it for you or aren't willing to do it, then go online. But I can find anything online. I just Google it.
Absolutely. All right, our next question here, this is from Teresa. She says, which batting should I use for a tablecloth? I don't want to make it too thick. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, for a tablecloth, that's a toughie, because tablecloths, you know, you want them to be able to launder easily. You don't want them to be poofy whatsoever, and you want them to fit well the table. So I use the very thinnest cotton I can find, and Dream Cotton again. It's not that it's my favorite brand, they just happen to carry some of my favorite battings. They have a very, very, very thin cotton, and I don't want to get this wrong. I believe it is called Request. They have Request and Select. Those are their two thinnest, and I'm pretty sure that Request is their absolute thinnest. In fact, it's just so very thin. Your other option is a product called Thermore, and it's by Hobbs, and it is used mostly in clothing. So you can imagine how thin it is, because it's used to make quilted vests or quilted jackets or whatever. And it is very thin. The downside is that it's polyester. So you really can't put a hot casserole down on that tablecloth, because you can melt that polyester. So just, you know, your thinnest, absolute thinnest cotton batting you can find, and or that wonderful Hobbs Thermore.
Perfect. All right, next question here. This is from Sue, and she says, what would be a fair, reasonable price per inch a long arm quilter charges?
Well, that's a loaded question. Are we talking about an all over pantograph, or are we talking about a very specific designed quilting just for that quilt? I think the pantographs are usually going, I may be wrong on this, because it has been a while since I've talked to a long armor about her prices. But I believe the pantographs are going for anything from 2 to 4 cents per square inch, and very specified quilting that is done for that quilt, designs that are done for the piecing inside and for the particular background, that particular border. I think they're going all the way up to 8 and 10 cents a square inch. So basically, you know, a couple $100 for a pantograph on a queen size, anywhere from $600, $700, $800, $900 for specialized quilting on a queen size that you're having quilting designed just for that quilt.
Perfect. All right, and next question here. This is from Melanie. She says, I just finished my first full-size quilt, and it's really pretty, but I put it in the washer, and when I pulled it out, several of the patches had separated. Short of taking it all apart, is it possible for me to fix it?
Well, I assume you quilted it before you put it in there. So you're not just talking about the quilt top. So this is a tough one. You're going to have to learn to applique real quick. So what you want to do is those areas that have come apart, you want to, so we're talking about, let's say it's 2 squares that came apart. And in those 2 squares, you have a seam allowance where that seam allowance was pressed to one side. You want to repress those fabrics so that the fabric that's supposed to be pressed away from itself is still pressed away from itself. And then the fabric that's sitting on top of that, basically forming that seam, you want to repress that 1/4 inch seam so it's nice and flat and laying on top of that first square. And then you will go in and take a little tiny hand stitch and basically applique the two together. Now, if your quilt fell apart in the washing machine, this is because it doesn't have enough quilting in it. If a quilt had proper quilting in it, there's no way it would fall apart in the washing machine on its first wash. In fact, it should never fall apart. The fabrics may fail. I've got a quilt on my bed that's 25 years old, and I've got one fabric that's failing all over it. The same one fabric everywhere that's found is failing. But I wash that quilt every month, and nothing else has ever come apart. So this is a lesson that says, you know, you really need to quilt your quilt much more heavily than you did if you're going to machine launder it. If it's tied, or if it's just quilted in the ditch or something like that every 10 inches or so, then it can't really go in the washing machine. The agitation, when it goes back and forth like this, that's the agitation, is too hard on it. The next time you wash a quilt like that, make sure that you don't agitate it. It can spin going in one direction, but it can't agitate back and forth. That damages the seams. So yeah, applique is what you're going to have to do to sew those patches back together.
Perfect. All right, our next question here is kind of a fun one. This is from Johnny. They say, to start off, I have zero quilting experience, none, but my mom is starting to get really into it, and I was wondering, from a quilter's standpoint, what would be a good quilting-related Mother's Day gift?
Oh, fabulous. That would be my my color book. I'm just going to push that one on you. The language of color design. No, it's, I think that pretty much any fabric would be a great thing. You can go to almost any quilt store and get wonderful packets of fabric that the store has put together. They're often called fat quarter packs. So those are nice, beautiful, and especially if you ask the store owner for what's the latest or newest fabrics that they have, then chances are your mom won't have them. So that's always a good idea. A beautiful selection of threads is also a great idea. And so lots of stores have boxes of threads already, but you could also put those together. New rotary cutting blades. We all go through those blades. And so having another 45 millimeter blade or another 60 millimeter blade is always a good thing. And you can always ask the quilt store owner too if there's some brand new book out that's really saucy. And then she can show you, you know, this one just came out. And again, chances are your mom won't have it. Nice thing is that if you go to a quilt store and you buy a book and your mom does have it, they usually will take exchanges, which is really nice. But those are things that are all we work through really quickly as quilters, and so it's nice to have those. Every quilter I know wants more fabric. Every quilter I know needs more thread, and every quilter I know runs over a pin the minute she changes her blade in her rotary cutter and wishes she had another blade. So we all need those extra blades. So I know that when my kids were young, those are the things I loved getting for Mother's Day. So
perfect. I love it. All right, our next question here, this is from Billy. They say, Heather, what advice would you give to a beginner quilter looking to get into creating art quilts? I've seen so many beautiful art quilts. It's intimidating knowing where to begin.
That is a hard one, and I'm going to say the same thing to you now more seriously. I wrote a book called what is it called? Fiber Artist Guide to Color and Design.
Yeah, bring that one on me. I didn't know the answer to that.
Anyway, it's got really great information about composition, about design, and it's got samples of quilts made from my students over all the years, and some of them are really great art quilts, some are a little bit more traditional, or any other book on art quilting techniques, and there's lots of them out there, just tons of them out there. However, that being said, you can read and read and read and read, but until you jump in, it's not going to make any sense, and it's not going to be very fulfilling. So my suggestion would be to find one technique that you think you'd like to try in art quilting and give it a try. And if you like it, then add it to your toolbox. If you don't like it, throw it out. And then do this 2 or 3 more times and build yourself a small little toolbox of techniques of piecing, techniques of embellishing, techniques of surface design, and then stop learning new things and practice what you've learned. One of the problems I've seen as a teacher, I had people who would take every single class I offered, and they were constantly learning new techniques, but they were never refining any of those techniques, and they were never taking the time to make those techniques their own. So again, 2, 3, at the most 4 new techniques, practice them, play with them, explore with them, make some really ugly work and make a few fabulous, fabulous pieces, and then continue to explore after that. I always say that once you feel like you've conquered something, then add a new technique. But don't just add technique after technique after technique, thinking that it's going to give you the answer. There is no answer to making art. Art is always a question. That's one of the things I like about it. And so you're never going to come to that, you know, that culmination of an answer. But you're never going to make really good art quilts if you keep doing nothing but exploring and you don't work. So, you know, there was a time, one year I made over 400 pieces in a year. Now, 280 odd of those were very small, but over 400 pieces in 1 year. A good artist knows that out of every 10 pieces she finishes, 1 or 2 are going to be really good. 2 or 3 others are going to be okay. The rest are going to be shite. And so that's what we all know, whether you're a potter or a jeweler or whatever, this is true. Not everything we make is going to be wonderful. And so if we are just playing with techniques and only finishing 1 or 2 pieces, it's going to take a long time to get to those really good pieces. So as an artist making art quilts, make more of them, make lots of them, make lots of mistakes, throw out stuff that doesn't work, keep the stuff that does. But explore in your own studio with your own information, and after you've garnered those few techniques, stop for a while and practice. That's what makes good art quilts, is people who are making quilts who have practiced a lot. So hopefully that helps.
Absolutely. All right, so this will kind of go into our next question here. It's kind of fun too. In your opinion, what is more popular nowadays, art quilts or traditional quilts?
I think that they're just as neck and neck as they've been for the last 10 or 15 years. I think that there are always going to be those who enter the quilting world for the tradition. They want to do what their grandmothers did, or the grandmothers did. They love old-fashioned fabrics. They love the idea of making things for the bed and for the home. And then there are those who are either tired of that and have moved on to the art quilting, or those who have never done traditional quilts and have gone straight to the art quilting because they simply love to touch and play and feel with fabric, and they have no interest in making bed quilts. They just want to make beautiful things for their home or their walls, for their tables, for their friends' houses, or they think they want to become an artist. So I don't think that one is more dominant than the other. I just feel that finally art quilters are getting good notice, and it's taken a long time for us art quilters to be validated. And the traditional quilting world, I think in the beginning was a little bit, you know, they would say those aren't really quilts. But now they realize that yes, they are, and they're both are just as valid as the other. So I think it's about equal.
Perfect. All right, next question here. This is from Maggie. Have you ever attempted to make a round quilt? And if so, do you have any tips?
No, I haven't, but I taught somebody to do some. Isn't that fun?
There's a quilt out there that you have not made.
Pardon?
I said there's a quilt out there that you have not made.
I have not made one myself, but a couple of years ago, I had a student who wanted my help with her making 3 round quilts that were part of a series. And the very first question was, how do we get round? And so what we did is we did that thing we did in school where we tied a string around a pencil and pinned the pencil, the end of the string in the middle of our fabric, and extended the pencil out and drew the big circle using it like a compass. And that is how we got our round shape. So, but we were doing an art quilt, like the last question. So there was no piecing or anything like that involved. It just happened to have a round background. This is something that I do not have a lot of experience with the exception of making Christmas tree skirts. I've made plenty of Christmas tree skirts in my day, designed quite a few, and they were round. But with round quilts, it's just not something I've done. So I really can't help you a lot there.
Well, so then what would be your tip for somebody making a Christmas tree skirt?
You know, the angle for me was always 30 degrees. Get to know your ruler. A lot of people have no idea what's happening on their ruler. And when you're doing round quilts, you often are working with lots of wedges. And that 30-degree angle seemed to be something that I was constantly using on those tree skirts. So I became very familiar with it. A lot of people don't even know they have a line on their ruler that is a 60-degree line and a 30-degree line, but you do. And it's easy to use, but you have to find it and go, oh, that's what it is. That's what that's for. So yeah, that would be the only thing I can help you with.
Perfect. All right, our next question, this is from Rachel. She says, my grandmother gave me some beautiful quilts that my great-grandmother made quite some time ago. I love them, but they reek of mothballs. I don't want to damage them by using harsh chemicals. Is there anything else that works well? I've tried soaking with vinegar and vinegar washes.
You want a product called Retain, R-E-T-A-Y-N-E. And it's a fancy way of spelling the word retain, R-E-T-A-I-N. And what Retain does is it cleans while it also basically pushes the color of the fabric into the color and holds it there so it can't fade during the wash. So it has a relationship with the dyes that are on the surface, but at the same time pulls the dirt off of the surface. It is a wonderful product. You can also use Orvus, O-R-V-U-S, which is a soap used to clean horses. It's kind of like the baby shampoo of the animal world, and it is also a very gentle soap, and so it would be great for washing vintage pieces in. However, it's not going to push that color in, so you might have some fading. So if I was going to do it, I would use Retain. And again, if you're not a quilter, or even if you are a quilter and it's not at your regular quilt store, Google it. You'll find a million places that sell it, including Amazon. I feel like I'm an Amazon shareholder or something. I'm not, I promise. It just happens to be an easy go-to. But R-E-T-A-Y-N-E, Retain, is the best thing to wash any type of vintage fiber or fabric in.
Perfect. All right, next question here. This is from Pam. Would you stitch in the ditch on a log cabin quilt or free design quilt?
Well, Pam, I'm never stitching in the ditch anywhere. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The ditch is for drunks. The ditch is really hard to stitch in. Plus, you never know what color thread to use because you'll be in, one color, the ditch is green, and then you move to the next patch and the ditch is red. So what color thread are you going to sew in? No, I usually do some sort of design on a log cabin that is inside the logs. I'd much rather do a concentric swirl inside the logs, or stitch, if it's a log cabin that's got half the side is light and half the side is dark, I'll stitch one design in the light and one design in the dark, keeping inside the piecing lines. Much more fun, much more interesting for the quilt too, rather than quilting in the ditch. Perfect.
All right, next question here. How do you keep the stitches from getting too large or too long when free motion quilting?
Well, we are in charge of our stitch length when we free motion quilt, and it is a correlation between the speed we're operating the machine and the speed at which we're moving our hands. So this just takes a little bit of practice and a little bit of paying attention, and we're trying to match the speed of our hands to the speed of the machine. What I suggest is if your machine has one of those little rabbits, one of the little things that you can go from a really low speed to a high speed. Most people don't even understand how you use that. If you put that on right in the middle and you floor your machine, it'll only go to medium speed. If you put it 3/4 of the max and floor your machine, it will only go 3/4 of the max. And that's where I suggest most people do their machine quilting, is somewhere between 50% and 3/4. 50% when you first start, 3/4 when you get a little bit more experienced. Once you've done that, then you have a consistent speed. You don't have to think about your speed again. And now all you have to think about is how quickly you're moving your hands. And most people do a lot of this, fast, slow when they machine quilt. And it's really a dance across the surface. It's a very slow motion. And if you keep that motion consistent, then your stitch length is going to be consistent. And so it just takes a little bit of practice of matching the speed of your hands to the speed of your quilt and seeing what those stitches look like when you're moving each of those things at a certain speed. And so I suggest practicing more, and you'll get more consistent, and you'll be happier with your stitch length.
Have you ever used one of the machines that has the stitch regulator on it?
You know, I know a lot of people love the stitch regulator. And if you have never machine quilted before, and you have somebody to teach you how to use the stitch regulator, so you've bought your machine from a dealer, reputable dealer that teaches you how to use your machine, then go for it. It could very well be a good tool. But I'm an old dog and asked to learn new tricks. To me, the stitch regulator actually gets in my way because it wants all control. And I want all control when I Freemotion quilt. So it becomes a battle of wills between me and the stitch regulator. So I am not a stitch regulator girl, but I'm not saying that they're not valuable. For new quilters who have never quilted before, they might be the answer, I don't know. However, I've had many people try to use them in many machine quilting classes and just watch them get in their way. So.
Just thought I've never used them before either. I've just seen machines that have them and wanted to know what your opinion was.
They're just another bell and whistle in my opinion.
Well, all right. Okay, our next question here is from Nicole. She says, are there any good books available on how to write paper piecing patterns?
I actually, yes. In fact, I actually researched this not too long ago for somebody, and I don't know how to get this information to you because I'll have to find it again, and because it's not off the top of my head. Maybe if she wrote in a question, however they do that we answered during the week.
Either write in a question, or if you just find it and then we can post it somehow underneath this video when I post it afterwards. There
is a really cool book out right now on designing paper piece patterns, and I did not know about it until somebody asked me the question, and I went and looked for it and found it, and I thought that is a really cool book. So I would love to find it again for you.
Perfect. Okay. Well, so as soon as you find it, we'll figure out how to get this information to you. Okay. Our next question here is from Joseph, and they say, I give quilt classes. What advice do you have for pricing per student? This part always gives me a headache.
Well, Joseph, you know, I taught full-time quilting classes all over the country, all over the Colorado, Santa Fe, and I made my living as a quilt teacher for close to 20 years, and I was expensive, and I had a lot of people say, "Oh, her classes are so expensive," and I'm a really damn fine quilt teacher, so I figured it was worth it. So I can tell you how I priced. When I stopped doing the teaching, which was about 2.5 years ago, I no longer teach. I'm retired, sort of, from teaching, but not from the rest of my work life.
But you still teach for us. You're just retired as like a...
Yes, but that's not per student. Yeah. You're the only place I teach for. Basically, I charged $30 per student for a 3-hour class, $45 per student for a 4.5 or 5-hour class, and $60 per student for a 7-hour class. These are the fees that I charge through stores or through my own studio. If I taught for a guild or for a big, large show, then I was $350 for a half-day class, up to 20 students, and $650 for a full-day class, up to 20 students. And so either way, that's kind of how I did it. I would not teach for less than 4 students ever. The store could choose to pay me for 4 students, even if there was only 2 students, because they didn't want to cancel the class, and that was their business. But my time is very valuable, always has been, and I think that teaching is, from a good teacher, is a gift. And if you let people know what you're worth and show them what you're worth, then they won't really, complain about it. One of the banes of my existence has always been the people who give away classes. They charge $25 for a full day class and then make my $60 full day class look ridiculous. And that's my fee. The store would add on another $25 or so. I think it's important that we get paid what we're worth. I also think it's important that we give and what we get paid for. So
So that was if you're going like through a quilt shop or someplace like that. If you were to just give, say, an individual lesson to somebody.
Well, I gave an individual lesson this last week. I had one student one day and 3 students the next day, and it was $500.
Perfect. Okay. Well, hopefully that gives them something to go off of, you know, to figure out their prices.
Yeah.
All right, next question here. If you aren't good at math, how do you figure out how much you need for a specific size quilt?
Well, that's a really tough one. It's very generic, and quilt yardage is not generic, because you can have a quilt that is nothing but 8-inch squares that only needs 4 yards for a queen size quilt, and then you can have a log cabin that is lots of strips and lots of seam allowance that is 9 yards for a queen size quilt. So basically you're going to get stuck doing the math. I just did a video on this that will be out soon, I hope, on this very thing, because basically what you do is you take your biggest, so if you look at the pattern, and why a pattern would tell you what to make but not tell you how much to get, I'm not sure, but it happens all the time. So let's say you decide you want to make a quilt that is nothing but 8-inch squares, and you have no idea how much yardage you're going to need. And you want the quilt to be 8 squares across, 64 inches, and 10 squares down, 8 inches, and you need to know how much yardage. Well, 8 times 10 is 80, so you need 80 of those 8-inch blocks. How many 8-inch blocks can you get out of the width of the fabric? Well, you want to go with about 40 inches. So that means you can get 5 of those blocks out of the width. So out of every 8 inches of fabric, you can get 5 blocks. You need 80 blocks. So then you have to figure out how many 8-inch strips of fabric you're going to need to get those 80 blocks. And you have to have a calculator. So I'm horrible at math challenge like you wouldn't believe. But my calculator on my phone is one of my absolute best friends. So calculators are very, very helpful. But that's kind of how you do it. You just basically see how many cuts you can get out of the cuts that are required from your 40-inch width of fabric, and then multiply that out by how many strips you're going to need to make those cuts.
Perfect. And I always get just a little bit extra.
A little bit more, yes.
Just in case.
Because sometimes we screw up with the cutting.
It's true. Plus, I mean, it never hurts to have some extra, just
nice
for
stash.
other projects too. All right. In your opinion, should we be ironing our quilt fabric with steam or with just a dry iron? I think steam gives a much better finish, but some people say it should never be used in quilting. What is your opinion?
In my opinion, we should never be ironing our quilt fabric at all.
Pressing.
We should be pressing it, and that is the problem. Steam or not steam really isn't the issue. I do prefer steam. I use steam all the time, especially if I'm doing intricate piecing. But the problem is that most people iron, and iron looks like this. When we iron, we move our iron back and forth. And pressing looks like this. Okay, so a press is not going to distort whether you use steam or not. Ironing is going to distort the heck out of things if you use steam. It's going to distort things a little bit if you don't use steam. So practice pressing, lifting the iron up and moving to the next spot, putting it down, lifting it up, moving to the next spot, rather than gliding the iron over the surface, which is what you do when you're ironing, you know, a linen blouse, not when you're ironing a strip set. So it's actually the technique that matters more so than whether or not you use steam.
Okay, and this is, I'm going to say, if you're using quilting cotton, but say you're using, since you do a lot of art quilting, you obviously use a lot of different types of fabric. Is there some fabrics that you shouldn't use steam on, things like that?
Well, there's some fabrics that, you know, I would never use in a quilt, but some people would use, and well, that's not true. I've used shears that are made out of polyester before. So polyester will melt with too much heat. So that's something you have to be very, very careful of when you're ironing or pressing. But other than that, no, I think they're pretty much, you know, if you can piece with them and they're a natural fiber, then you can iron them.
All right, perfect. All right, next question here. This is from Marianne. She says she's 70, and just like the other question, I have a quilt that has been handed down through 5 generations. It was quilted in the mid to late 1800s. I know all of the names, including the grandmother that quilted it. How do I make sure that my descendants know this? Do I label it? I'm leery of doing that, but can't think of any other way.
I would definitely label it. I would make up a nice little label on a very simple fabric, probably a muslin, and I would hand applique it to the back. And I think that since you have that information, you get to be the storyteller, and that's fabulous. And a quilt like this deserves to have some good, healthy information put on the back. And it's a family heirloom. And I think that you know, if you were to do it any other way, could get separated from the quilt. So yes, make a label, put it on the back.
Absolutely, perfect.
Don't use Wonder Under or anything like that.
You doing that so that it could be then removed if you wanted it to? Is that why?
No, because it just goes with the quilt's age, and I just don't believe in Wonder Undering you know, I shouldn't say Wonder Under because that's a brand name, but
but Wonder Undering
iron-on adhesive to apply a label. I think if you're going to go through the steps of placing a label on the back, it should be hand appliqued on.
Perfect. All right, we have time for one more question here, and this they say, I have a terrible time with accurate 1/4-inch seams. How can I accomplish this?
I have another video just to answer this too, but before it comes out, I'll give you the gist of it. Go to your local drugstore and buy the heavy duty padded stuff with the sticky back that you use for corns. I can't think of the name of it right now.
Moleskin.
Pardon?
The moleskin?
Moleskin, thank you, moleskin. And cut yourself a piece of it that's about a 1/2 inch wide by about 1 inch to 1.5 inches long. And take your ruler and set it right underneath the foot of your machine, and then put your foot down, and then very slowly rotate your needle down and move that ruler back and forth until the needle hits right at the 1/4-inch line. When it hits right at the 1/4-inch line, stick that moleskin right next to that ruler. The thing is that the moleskin's got about 1/8 of an inch, maybe even, I don't know, yeah, about 1/8 of an inch of maybe 3/16 of height. And that allows you to run your fabric right up next to it, and it won't jump over it. And it gives you that extra protection to keep it kind of in that slot almost, and will help you with and get a much more accurate 1/4-inch.
Okay. And then just to follow up on this, because I know a video that you did for us just got posted, and it's whether or not it's accurate to cut off of your cutting mat grid lines or your ruler grid lines.
Whenever possible, cut off your ruler. Whenever possible, cut off your ruler. Cut off your ruler. It's more accurate, and it's easier to manipulate and move around. Your ruler, your ruler, your ruler. Okay,
perfect. Okay, well, I want to thank you again for being here to answer all of our questions. And we will get the information for that one question and post that either in the comments of this video or somehow get that to the person who asked it. And then once again, you'll be back next month to answer more of our quilting questions. All right, perfect. Everyone have a wonderful night.
Okay, you too.